My inquiry question was focused on grammar, and the question was, what happens when a grammar skill is implicitly taught through modeling, mentor text, and continued center work paired with small group instruction for struggling learners? The students that were targeted were students that had trouble with run-on sentences in their literary essays this past unit, and they were 8 students that I worked with that ranged from ages 12 to 13. The purpose of this inquiry question was to decide how to better instruct grammar within my language arts classroom. I work off of the Columbia Teachers College Readers and Writers Project workshop method, which doesn't really include explicit grammar instruction. And I've always found that my students' grammar skills are not as strong as grammar skills could be. I've run different grammar centers before and have done optional mini lessons before for my students on skills that they felt that they needed to work on, hoping that my students would become better self-advocates and reflectors, thinking about the skills that they needed to work on, particularly because some of the students that I have do have great grammar and mechanics skills, but some other students are really struggling because of the lack of explicit grammar instruction in our particular program. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to see how I could better implement the grammar instruction through this mini inquiry project. My goals for the project were to have the students correctly identify run-on sentences that were in paragraphs. These were student paragraphs that I actually pulled from actual literary essays that were submitted by the kids. I wanted them to be able to edit these run-on sentences by transforming them into complete sentences. So they could have done this 2 ways. It could have either been broken down into 2 separate sentences, or maybe even more than 2 separate sentences, because some student run-ons that I would find would be lines and lines long. The other way that they could have remedied the run-on sentence would be making a compound sentence, joining 2 independent clauses together with a conjunction. The last part of the task was to have students create a cohesive paragraph on our new skill that we were working on with our nonfiction unit in their objective summaries, ensuring that they had no run-on sentences and that they also were utilizing the skills taught, making sure that they had a compound sentence with 2 independent clauses separated by a conjunction. On the first day, I gave the students a sample paragraph that had 3 run-on sentences included within the paragraph. I sent the paragraph home with the students for homework and provided lines below the paragraph for the students to rewrite the run-on sentences that they identified and found. And I was looking to see how they would, number 1, identify run-on sentences, and number 2, rewrite those sentences. 6 out of the 8 students were able to identify all run-on sentences, but I realized quickly that most of the students had trouble with correcting the sentences. 2 students were unable to identify 1 sentence apiece. They got 2 out of the 3 sentences correct in their paragraph pretest. Upon returning the pretest paragraphs to the students on the second day of instruction, I had the students have a simple discussion about the task that they performed on the first day on the pretest. And the students were discussing what they found difficult about the task with the run-on sentences. Most students discussed the fact that they didn't really have an idea of how to correct particular sentences, besides breaking them down into smaller, maybe stubbier sentences. The students that were only able to identify 2 out of the 3 run-on sentences that I placed into the paragraph were students that were unable to identify comma splice run-on sentences, and these students were discussing that they didn't know that that was a run-on sentence. I was purposeful into teaching into comma splices and how to correct them using a conjunction. and also how to add conjunctions to make a compound sentence. The students were mostly aware of the fanboys acronym, which are the different conjunctions, but some of them admittedly did not know what fanboys stood for. Some of them were able to identify, and we were kind of having a discussion at the table as the students chorally were saying out loud the different conjunctions as they were going through the acronym. I modeled with the paragraph how to correct particular run-on sentences by breaking down these run-on sentences into smaller sentences, and also separating the two independent clauses of a comma splice while adding a comma and adding a conjunction. Afterwards, I had the student practice on a compound sentences, how to form compound sentences with conjunctions worksheet, and that was the end of that lesson for day 2. On day 3, the students were reminded about compound sentences, and I collected the worksheet from the night before, and the students were given a brief reading passage to go through on which they had to identify all compound sentences. And 8 out of 8 students were able to identify all compound sentences. They were able to go through and find the sentences that were separated with a comma and a conjunction. This proved to me that even just teaching into this simple skill and having them practice quickly on a worksheet during time where they had a little bit of free time in class, they were able to learn this skill really quickly, and they were also able to, number one, know the terminology, and then go off and identify these particular sentences within a brief reading passage that was given to them afterwards. On day 4, the students were given back their literary essays, and they had to find 1 to 2 sentences that were run-on sentences within their literary essays, of which they could correct their own sentences and turn them into complete sentences, not run-on sentences. So I had the students go through and read briefly, find 1 to 2 run-on sentences. Most students were able to do this very quickly. As they located these different sentences, they had to either decide to turn them into smaller sentences if it was 3 to 4 line run-on, or turn it into simply a compound sentence if it was more like a comma splice type of run-on sentence. So I challenged the students to first find the sentences within their literary essays, and then turn and talk to each other at the table as they sat with each other. They had to go off and discuss with each other whether they thought that theirs was one that had to be broken down into a few different sentences, or if it could simply be turned into a compound sentence. As they discussed with each other, students also gave each other suggestions, because the students were various ranges of leveled students. So students were saying like, I'm not really sure if you want to turn that into 2 smaller sentences. That could easily be fixed with a comma and a conjunction. After the students performed this task, it was found that 8 out of 8 were able to correctly identify run-on sentences, at least 1 to 2 within their own literary essays. However, one particular student was still breaking down his run-on sentences into shorter, stubbier sentences when it could have simply been put into a compound sentence. This student was resistant to the feedback from his peers, but when I sat down with him, he was able to then easily convert the 2 shorter, stubbier sentences into a compound sentence. So my final task on day 5 was originally to have the students take a nonfiction reading passage with a given claim, but instead I had just taught objective summaries to the students, and I figured to make it more authentic to what the students were doing, I would have the students construct their objective summaries and then pull them and check for run-on sentences in their objective summaries. As I pulled the 8 different students on day 5 of the task, they very quickly knew what I was going to have them do as they pulled up their objective summaries before turning them in through Google Classroom at the table. The students quickly started to go through their objective summaries, trying to identify any run-on sentences, and 3 out of the 8 students identified a run-on sentence, at least one run-on sentence in their objective summaries. But once they identified the run-on sentence, they then have the tools to go off and correct the run-on sentences. And we had a discussion at the back table that as writers, we usually do an idea dump out on our papers. So we get all of the ideas out of our head and put them down on the paper, but it's then our duty as a writer to go back and reread at least twice and revise any or edit any mistakes that we might have made. So now that they had the skills to identify the run-on sentences and then correct the run-on sentences, the task was easily managed and executed. So my findings were that 8 out of 8 students were able to identify and correct run-on sentences in their own writing at the end of the inquiry project. However, 3 out of the 8 still wrote with run-on sentences in their objective summaries. As a result of conducting this plan, I found that it's more important to purposefully teach into grammar-specific skills with students, kind of a mix of explicitly and implicitly, showing it within the work and in the context of which we're doing it in the classroom, not having separate grammar lessons, but incorporating it into the work that we're completing in the classroom at the time. This way it's meaningful and it can be directly applied to their writing. I also learned that the teacher does have to actually name the skill for the students in order for them to understand it and also model the skill. Whereas in the past, it had been demonstrated to me through Readers and Writers workshop days as putting it as center work with the skill kind of named on a little chart at the table, and the students would self-directedly teach themselves the skill, identify good uses of it within writing, and kind of practice the skill on their own. I found it more successful for me to actually explicitly name the skill out, model the skill, and then give them implicit ways to apply it directly to what they were doing in class at the time or what they had already done in class. My question for the future based off of this inquiry task would be, run-on sentences are a pretty common and well-known mistake that kids make with grammar, but if they were given a task such as coordinating conjunctions or restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, would that terminology and kind of their unknowing of those particular grammar skills or mechanical skills, would that be a little bit more intimidating, and would they more so be as engaged to fix those particular things within their writing? Or would it be more overwhelming, and would they shut down when I would try to model or teach into those things? Would it be boring? So that's kind of my question for the future. Whereas this particular inquiry project may work for particular skills, would it work for more intimidating, tougher grammatical, mechanical skills that the students would have to work on within their writing?